Video games. Once a niche concept turned into one of the most marketable forms of entertainment out there. Huge stories, vast worlds, iconic characters, games from Super Mario Bros. To Call of Duty. Most of what we know about modern gaming stems from the success of Nintendo in the 80s and 90s, but often we forget to tell the story of their once biggest rival, SEGA. SEGA used to be one of the biggest players in the industry, and now they only occasionally develop or publish games. How do they start and grow so big, only to come crashing down? SEGA video games started in Hawaii in 1940 by the name Standard Games, who created coin slot machines and jukeboxes for military bases. The company was moved to Japan in 1952 and was renamed Service Games of Japan. It soon merged with Rosin Enterprises to create what we know today as SEGA Enterprises. SEGA started importing arcade games from Chicago in 1961, but when the arcade industry in America started to decline due to stagnation and lack of innovation from Chicago manufacturers, SEGA had the idea to start making their own arcade systems and games. Soon, SEGA had an arcade presence in 200 Japanese arcades. This worked for SEGA for a while. However, as technology grew, so did the video game industry. Jump forward to the 1980s. SEGA decided to start targeting and selling to the home market by selling games for at-home PCs, with the Sega's SG-1000 and SG-1002 in 1983. This had immediate consequences as their sales were slowed down in the US due to the video game market crash of '83.
Atari, the industry's biggest player, wanted to retain market share in the face of all this competition, and their solution was to rush games through development. That was not a good solution.
They also had to compete against the new Nintendo Famicom, which was a huge success, so their first PC consoles were indeed deemed a failure. Nintendo licensing deals prevented third-party games as well. Nintendo also had their iconic characters like Donkey Kong to lean on and boost sales. However, because of their big name in the arcade and toy business, this was enough to keep SEGA stable. Their big break came in 1985 when they once again tried to compete against Nintendo's Americanized Famicom, the Nintendo Entertainment System, with their own Sega Master System. The Sega Master System was more powerful, but not as marketable as Nintendo's console. Despite this, it was still a pretty big hit among the video game world, especially in places like Western Europe and Brazil where Nintendo was not as popular. SEGA had some popular games like Alex Kidd in the Miracle World and Wonder Boy, giving them their own set of IPs to try and compete with Mario and Zelda. Still, the Master System stayed the second most popular home gaming system, with Nintendo still strong-arming developers for exclusivity if they wanted a spot on the NES. In 1988, SEGA started to take the console war seriously, releasing their new console, the Mega Drive, better known in America as the Sega Genesis. The Genesis was a big deal as it was the first home console to boast a 16-bit pixel structure, compared to the Master System, as well as the still-selling Nintendo Entertainment System's 8 bits.
Free. What Nintendo?
This also allowed more vibrant colors and a gaming experience closer to the arcades, with many arcade ports such as Ghosts and Ghouls and Mortal Kombat. Following their shiny new toy hitting the market, in the early 90s, SEGA launched the game series that would rival Nintendo's Mario, and serve as the face of SEGA's company. That game was Sonic the Hedgehog. The popularity of Sonic made Sega Genesis outsell its main competitor, Nintendo's Super Nintendo Entertainment System, in the US nearly 2-1 during the 1991 holiday season. It led to Sega having control of 65% of the 16-bit console market in January 1992, making it the first time Nintendo was not the console leader since December 1985. When it came to graphics of both Nintendo and Sega, it seems Sega had the advantage with their consoles having better graphics and pictures, as well as less censorship, with games like Mortal Kombat retaining its bloody violence like the arcade, compared to Nintendo censoring it completely. Sega continued in its feud with Nintendo for years, and even though Sega had a leg up with better graphics, they could not seem to keep up with Nintendo's ever-growing sales and popularity. Sega attempted anything to gain more popularity, including add-ons to already existing hardware. This included the Sega CD that released in Japan, North America, and in Europe from 1991 to 1993.
There is no Nintendo CD. Understood?
As an add-on to the Sega Genesis, this was one of the first pieces of home console hardware to utilize CDs as the gaming medium, rather than a game cartridge. Sales had come to a standstill, with Sega having one more trick up its sleeve before mid-decade. Sega released a second add-on for the Genesis, called the Sega 32X. The add-on was quickly abandoned along with the Sega CD as they moved towards their next console, releasing at the tail end of 1994, the Sega Saturn, a fully CD-based console. And only 11 days later, Sony released the everlasting PlayStation. The Saturn did marginally well, but still paled in comparison to 1996's Nintendo 64 and Sony's new powerhouse. It reached globally up to around 9 million sales, not even close to Sony's 102 million units sold of the PlayStation, and still behind the outdated cartridge system of the Nintendo 64, who had 32 million. Sega was running out of steam by the late 90s, and with one more chance, in 1998 news of Sega's Dreamcast was released, and many people were putting in pre-orders.
We got her! Hi, Randy.
Well, hello.
It's thinking.
Sega felt confident about this system, but they couldn't fulfill demands due to a shortage of working power VR chipsets caused by a high failure rate in the manufacturing process. Shipping had to come to a full stop, and things were looking less than positive. On top of this, only one of the 4 launch titles for the Dreamcast sold well, this being Virtua Fighter 3, a port of an existing arcade game. The Dreamcast had marginally decent sales in the US, but those sales were not as steady as Sony's PlayStation, which still held 60% of the market. Sega's $404 million consolidated net loss in the financial year ended in March 2000, which followed a similar loss of $323 million the previous year, and marked Sega's 3rd consecutive annual loss. On January 31st, 2001, Sega announced that the Dreamcast would be discontinued after March 31st, and that the company would become a platform-agnostic third-party developer. By the next generation, Sega was nowhere to be seen. Nintendo had their GameCube and Sony had the PlayStation 2, and newcomer longtime PC company Microsoft had entered the market with the Xbox. They continue to make and sell video games, but they are no longer in the console war. So what's left of Sega? They still make games, publish a lot, and seem to have tried branching out into TV and film. They have a good relationship with Nintendo these days. Despite still being around and successful, they're a shadow of what they once were, a frontrunner in the game industry.